so much to New Yorkers for Clean Power for organizing this lunch and learn, inviting me to share out a little bit about where we're at on the energy storage front here in New York State. Very pleased to see how many folks took their lunch hour to join us today, so thank you again. Let me see if I can get this. Can you all see my screen? Perfect. All right, so as Len mentioned, I'm Claudia Villar-Lehman. I lead policy and regulatory affairs for New York Best. We are the energy storage trade group for New York, a nonprofit organization working to advance the deployment of energy storage in line with the state's climate and energy affordability goals. So all right, I just got a Zoom pop up. All right, here we go. So we're going to talk a little bit today about how energy storage supports our electricity grid. But first, I wanted to provide a little more context on the energy transition and a little bit more about how the grid works today. So getting started, you may have heard about the general pillars of the energy transition. We know we want to decarbonize our energy system and make sure that we have a more equitable and affordable system for everyone. But what's the way that we're going to do that? Well, first and foremost, we always need to try to use less energy. The less energy that we use, the less new clean energy we need to build and pay for. So energy efficiency is always the lowest hanging fruit. Second, we want to electrify wherever we can so that we're not running our buses on diesel, we're using electricity. We're not running our natural gas boilers for heat. We are using electricity much cleaner, better for clean air, health outcomes, etc. But of course, if we're electrifying everything, we need to make sure that electricity that we're using to power all of these devices is actually clean. So of course, we're going to need lots of renewables to do that. Lots of people have heard about solar, people have heard about wind. I would say maybe one of the unsung heroes of the clean electricity transition is energy storage, one that people haven't necessarily heard as much about, but that is absolutely essential to making sure those renewables are available when we need them. So talking a little bit about some history of how the grid works, just to get into our thinking of, what has made our electric grid what it has been in the past and where do we go from here? So first, a little bit of history. So New York, in case you weren't aware, has long been a leader in electricity innovation. We really played a central role in the birth of the electric grid, all the way back to the late 1800s when Thomas Edison built the first commercial power plant in the US right in Lower Manhattan on Pearl Street. And that power plant provided electricity and steam to buildings in a 5-block radius, which for the time was very, very long distance. And if you happen to go by that area on Pearl Street, you'll see this plaque on the right, which marks the spot of where that power plant once stood. Just about a decade later, New York again led the way with the first transmission line built in the state. And that brought power 22 miles from the Niagara Falls hydropower plant all the way to Buffalo. So you can see the picture on the left, which was really revolutionary at the time. Of course, now we see those all across the state. And these really marked the beginning of what is now a pretty complex system of transmission lines that crisscross the state. And you can see on the right side of the screen, today's NYISO, or New York Independent System Operator, is the name of our electric grid operator. That's the backbone of the electricity transmission system that they manage and operate here in New York State. So you can see that it's really expanded into a pretty complex system. One of the biggest challenges with electricity is that, pretty much unlike any other commodity, this is a delivery system without a warehouse. If you think about it, if you ran a potato company and you didn't sell all of your potatoes one day, you could store them in a warehouse until demand picks back up again. But electricity, for pretty much the whole history of electricity's existence, hasn't had a way to store electricity at scale. And that means that supply and demand need to be balanced pretty much every second. So when you flip on your light switch or run your dishwasher, a power plant somewhere needs to generate a little bit more electricity to meet that extra demand. And somebody needs to be paying attention to make sure that the right amount of power is being generated for all the amount of power that people want to consume. So I mentioned the NYISO, they're a grid operator. This is a picture of their headquarters just outside of Albany, and you can see from the picture how complicated their job is. They balance the available supply of power every 6 seconds, every day of the year, from hundreds of power plants over thousands of miles of transmission lines, serving all the millions of customers in New York State who use electricity like us. And when there's no way to store the power, you basically have to build out the system to be able to meet peak demand. So electricity demand is not stable throughout the year. There's times when people want more power, usually in the afternoons, in the summertime, when everyone turns their AC on and uses up a lot of electricity. And there's times when people want less power, like when the weather is mild or when we're all asleep at night. But because there's no real way to store power, we have to build out the whole system just to meet peak demand.
Mm.
And so as a result, our system ends up being pretty overbuilt, and that's a pretty expensive way to run an electricity system. When we didn't used to have a way to store power, it made sense as the only option. But now that we do, we can start to change that. So here you can see a graph showing how many hours of the year we get close to peak demand. This is a graph just of New York City. I should have swapped it out for the one for New York State because I know we've got a broader audience today. But imagine we're just talking about New York City. Peak electricity demand in New York City is about 11,000 megawatts. But you can see that we only hit that a very small handful of hours out of the entire year.
Mm.
Most of the time, we're right in the middle of the graph where the line becomes horizontal, which is about 6,000 megawatts. So most of the time, we're only using about half of the megawatts that the grid is capable of providing. But we have paid to overbuild the system just to meet the peak hours of the year. So that means that the cost to deliver your power often costs more than the power itself. So we have a little bit of a ironic situation where the shipping costs more than the product. If you imagine ordering something on Amazon for $20, but you're paying $50 for shipping, it sometimes
Mm.
feels a little bit out of balance. For most people's electricity bills, if you've ever taken a close look at your electricity bill, you might see that you've got both supply charges and delivery charges listed on the bill. So the supply charges circled here in purple, and this is an example residential electric bill from an apartment in New York City. You can see that the product, or how much did it cost to generate the actual electricity, was about $42. And that cost is based largely on the cost of natural gas. So we do see some volatility, like a few years ago when Russia invaded Ukraine, caused a lot of disruption in natural gas prices. We saw a lot of spike on the supply charge side of our electricity bill. There's a risk that that similar thing could happen again, given all of the disruption happening now in the Middle East. On the right side of the screen, circled in red, is the delivery charge side of the picture. So that's the shipping. Here we see this is $93, so more than twice the cost of the product itself. And this cost is generally determined based on building out infrastructure to meet that peak hour of demand. Even though we don't need that much electricity most of the year, we still have to pay for the infrastructure to be able to meet it when needed. So energy storage can help actually on both sides. On the left side, helping us, reduce our reliance on natural gas by integrating more renewables and also help stabilize between volatility, high energy prices and low energy prices on the supply side. And then on the delivery side, they can help us reduce the need to build out new infrastructure to meet peak demand and help us control the delivery side of the equation as well. So you can kind of think of this analogy of electricity transmission lines being kind of like highways, trying to bring electricity into the place where people need it, whether that's into New York City or into the towns and cities across New York State. Just like rush hour traffic for cars trying to get into the, dense population centers, electrons also hit congestion on the transmission lines that are bringing power into those locations. And the traditional solution before we had storage would be to build more transmission lines, just like building new highways or building out new lanes on the highways. But of course, that's pretty expensive. That's a costly endeavor that would result in driving up rates for everyone. Instead, energy storage really provides a new option. What if we shift when we're bringing power into the city to maximize the use of wires or highway lanes in the analogy that we already have? So we know that in the middle of the night, these lanes might be empty. What if we could bring in the power at those times, make more use of the wires that we already have, and then store the power right near where it's going to be needed during the peak hours the next day? So that's basically what storage can do. Here you can see a graph of a simulated load curve on Long Island. The red line shows approximate megawatt demand. So you can see between 1 a.m. and 9 a.m. is the lowest electricity demand when people are, still asleep, still just getting up in the mornings. Then it ramps up throughout the day and it hits peak demand around 5 p.m., maybe when people are coming home, starting to use all their appliances, etc. And then it drops back down again. So energy storage can charge up in the middle of the night or around 3 a.m. when demand is lowest, and then discharge that power back to the people who are going to need it during those peak hours in the afternoon. That helps make the wires that we already have more efficient because we're using them more frequently than just 50%, which is our current grid utilization. It helps drive down rates because we don't have to pay for new wires to be built just to meet increasing electricity demand. And it also helps us reduce reliance on peaker plants, particularly in denser areas of the state like New York City, Long Island, Syracuse, etc., helping clean up our air for people who live in those dense locations. So again, energy storage helps us use what we already have more efficiently. We're in a situation where electricity demand is increasing across the state. Some of that is, we've probably heard of data centers and AI, but some of it is just because electricity demand is increasing separate from that. And our grid is aging, and so we're going to need to invest in the grid. But building storage is a lot more cost effective than traditional solutions. You can see a picture here of a Con Ed substation in Brooklyn. In the last rate case, Con Ed proposed several new substations and substation expansions as part of the rate case that would directly contribute to raising bills. So to the extent that energy storage can be a more cost-effective alternative than building these new substations, then that's something that the state should be advancing. In fact, NYSERDA's analysis showed that if we do hit our goal, which is 6 gigawatts of storage by 2030, we would get over $2 billion in system cost savings. And that doesn't even count all the savings from improved public health and savings on the distribution system as well. On the sustainability side, I always like to highlight this example from California. So California is pretty far ahead of us in deploying energy storage, but that really only happened in the 2020s. So you can see in 2021, they didn't really have very much storage on the grid at all. And they had a lot of solar power, which is great. But as soon as the sun set a little before 8 p.m., you can see their reliance on gas and imports increases dramatically right around sunset. However, just 3 years later, they've done a great job at deploying lots of battery storage, and you can see that that really allows them to extend the life of their solar power even after the sun sets, dramatically reducing how much reliance they have on gas and imports. And so the more energy storage we can deploy, the more we can take advantage of solar and wind, even when it's not sunny or windy out. On the air quality and health side, so right now we do have a lot of in-city peaker plants that run on fossil fuels. These are great candidates for replacement by batteries because they typically only run during peak hours. And our friends at the Peak Coalition and a coalition of different advocacy groups based in New York City, they showed over $1 billion in avoided health costs by eliminating the pollution from peaker plants and replacing that with clean energy and batteries. So this can be a really significant, 1 billion is of course a staggering monetary number, but that also represents avoided deaths, avoided hospital trips, avoided, having to stay home from school because the kid has asthma. Like these are real life quality of life concerns. And so enabling more storage to help us close down these plants is really essential. So how much storage does New York need? Across the state, we are aiming for 6 gigawatts of energy storage by 2030. That was a statewide target set by Governor Hochul. Currently, we're only at about half a gigawatt, so we do have a solid amount more that we need to deploy in the next few years. Though NYSERDA has released a number of different incentives, both for energy storage of all sizes, that is going to help accelerate deployment. New York City is going to need about a third of the statewide goal, again, because it's such a dense area where there's a lot of high electricity demand and a lot of transmission congestion. So about a third of the goal, or 2 gigawatts, is going to be needed within the 5 boroughs by 2030, and the remaining 4 gigawatts likely needed spread out across the rest of the state. So what is this going to look like for our towns and cities? Well, energy storage comes in lots of different shapes and sizes. It's modular, which is one of its benefits. So you can have something as small as a backup wall, battery wall for a residential home, 1 to 2 family. One that people may have heard of is a Tesla Powerwall. There's lots of other companies that also make similar systems. Those can provide backup power for a single house, and they can also help provide power back to the grid during times of stress by signing up for programs like demand response or virtual power plants. For larger buildings, building scale systems are also an option. This often looks like maybe a couple of fridges pushed close together. This is an image of one that is at the New York Power Authority headquarters in White Plains. Community scale or retail is something that we're seeing much more commonly in cities, but also in towns across the state. These are great because they provide benefits to entire neighborhoods. So even if it's, if you live in an apartment building and you can't necessarily get a residential battery just for one home, a community scale battery can support the entire neighborhood, making blackouts less likely in that area, and also providing direct monetary benefits by reducing the need for new infrastructure build out. And there's also a program called Statewide Solar for All, where these community scale batteries generate bill discounts, and the utilities automatically apply those discounts to customers who are enrolled in the energy affordability program or low-income customers, so that we ensure that people who need the discounts or need support paying their electricity bills the most are the ones that are getting the discounts first. And then finally, there's the kind of power plant scale or bulk storage projects. These are the ones that are going to help replace power plants because of their size.